Hello, welcome to the Yuma County Library District virtual program. I'm Kevin Blinn from the San Luis branch, and today I will be talking about fantasy literature and its subgenres.
Brandon Sanderson, one of today's most prolific fantasy authors, once said of his genre, "Fantasy is awesome because you can do everything. Now granted, I'm willing to bet that anyone who writes in genre is going to say that their genre is awesome, and that's great. But for me, I've read fantasy books with as much literary style as any literary novel out there. I've read fantasy books with as much romance as any romantic fiction out there, as good mysteries as any mystery fiction, so fantasy can do all this, plus have dragons, so why not?" The roots of fantasy literature go back as far as the written word. Ancient tales of gods and monsters and of heroes fighting evil on a cosmic scale are found in the ancient texts of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a 4,000-year-old Babylonian poem, would be familiar in its structure to modern epic fantasy, with its unusual protagonists on a quest that takes them all over the known world. Modern fantasy thus draws on thousands of years of tradition and inspiration, from fairy tales to mythology to real-world history. Fantasy has appeared in a large number of mediums, from movies and TV to comics and video games to works of art. However, most stories start out as books. Within fantasy literature, there are a number of different subgenres. Each has a slightly different take on similar themes and will appeal to different readers, or to the same readers in different moods. Plus, they can have dragons. Here are just a few of them. Epic fantasy. Epic fantasy is what most people think when they hear the word fantasy. Epic fantasy is typically set in another world, usually with magic and strange or wondrous creatures. There is often a great conflict between good and evil, with the fate of the world in the balance. Although many modern works cast their protagonists in a more morally ambiguous light. They typically have large casts of characters and developed histories spanning thousands of years. It is common for epic fantasy literature to be longer than most other books and to be part of a series. Notable works include The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is in many ways the first modern epic fantasy work, and it set the tone for most of those that followed. A group of heroes from all over Middle-earth goes on a dangerous voyage to stop the forces of a Dark Lord from taking control of the world. A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. This series became familiar to many as the basis of a hit HBO TV show. It is the story of a group of noble houses vying for control of the continent of Westeros while a much greater threat looms in the background. The Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson. Part of the author's larger Cosmere setting, this series follows a number of participants in a war in the strange land of Roshar as magic begins to return after an absence of thousands of years. Urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is typically set in a city in the modern world, or one like it. The focus is usually on a single protagonist, often a skilled practitioner of magic. He or she often works in law enforcement, private investigation, or vigilantism. His or her foes are often creatures from real-world mythologies rather than inventions of the author. The magic forces at work may be out in the open, or they may be hidden from an unsuspecting populace, part of what is often called the masquerade. Notable works include The Southern Vampire Mysteries by Charlaine Harris. These formed the basis for the HBO show True Blood. Sookie Stackhouse is a waitress and telepath in a fictional Louisiana town. Her friends, neighbors, and enemies include not only vampires, but also werewolves, fairies, and shapeshifters. Some of these creatures are out to the general public, but others remain hidden. The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. Harry Dresden is a wizard detective in Chicago who fights foes both supernatural and mundane, and attempts to preserve the masquerade. The books are written in a style reminiscent of the film noir mysteries of the 1930s and 1940s. The Kate Daniels series by Ilona Andrews. Kate Daniels is a mercenary in post-apocalyptic Atlanta, in which the world shifts frequently and suddenly between magical and technological dominance. She gets involved in disputes between humans, shapeshifters, and creatures from Russian and Middle Eastern mythology. Paranormal romance. Paranormal romance is a close cousin of urban fantasy. Here, however, the mythological monsters are more likely to be the love interest than the antagonist. The potential lovers often come from very different worlds, which are hidden from each other or otherwise in conflict. Emphasis tends to be placed more on the romance than on the world-building, magic, or other elements commonly associated with fantasy. But of course, all these aspects can be present. Notable works include Twilight by Stephanie Meyer. A girl who moves to live with her father falls in love with a 100-year-old vampire. The popularity of the series paved the way for a number of young adult paranormal romance series as well as hit movies. The Carpathian novels by Christine Feehan. These are also known as the Dark Series. The Carpathians are an ancient race of powerful magical creatures who live in secret alongside humanity. They are on the verge of extinction as no female has been born among them in centuries, until a Carpathian man finds his soulmate in a human woman. Historical fantasy. Historical fantasy is set within our own world, much like urban fantasy. However, as the name implies, it is usually set in the past. This could be an alternate history or could be a specific time and place. Common examples are Arabian, Celtic, or Greco-Roman based fantasy. In this way, historical fantasy may be seen as the modern successor to fairy tales. Notable works include Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. In this series, a 20th century British woman accidentally transports herself back to 18th century Scotland, where she finds adventure and romance. It is the basis for a TV series on the Starz Network. The Extraordinary Adventures of the Athena Club by Theodora Goss. This is a trilogy of books set in Victorian London. The protagonists are the daughters or other female relatives of some of literature's most notable mad scientists. They work to counter the mysterious and villainous alchemist society. Humorous fantasy. Humorous fantasy, as you might imagine, puts an emphasis on humor. Sometimes it comes from the situations that the characters find themselves in. Sometimes it comes from parodying or satirizing the tropes and cliches that are commonly found in fantasy. Notable works include Discworld by Terry Pratchett. These books describe the adventures of the inhabitants of a world held up by elephants standing on the back of an enormous spacefaring turtle. Early books in this series were specifically parodies of epic fantasy. Later books would satirize everything from religion to war to Australia. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies by Seth Grahame-Smith. The familiar story of Pride and Prejudice is rewritten, now taking place amidst a zombie apocalypse. The book was adapted to film and inspired a number of similar stories that added monsters or other horror elements to classical works of literature.
We hope you enjoyed this look at fantasy literature. These titles are available for checkout at your library.